I had exactly 72 hours to clear out everything my girlfriend and I had built together in that apartment before the locks were changed. Not a phone call, not a knock on the door. A legal notice slipped under the mat on a Wednesday morning, the kind printed on stiff white paper with a city seal at the top that makes your stomach drop before you even read the first line. My girlfriend, I'll call her my partner, because that's what she was in every real sense. She found it first. She was still in her scrubs from a night shift at the hospital. She stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper, and the look on her face was something I'd never seen from her before. Not anger. Just this hollow, exhausted disbelief. We had lived in that Vancouver apartment for 4 years, rent-controlled, facing the alley, ground floor, with a radiator that clicked all winter. We loved it. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I was 28, working as a freelance architectural draftsman, the kind of job that sounds impressive until someone asks how much it pays. She was a registered nurse, pulling 12-hour shifts at Vancouver General. Between us, we made it work. We'd even started talking about whether we could buy something someday. Not in Vancouver proper, obviously. Nobody our age was buying anything in Vancouver proper. But maybe somewhere. The notice informed us that our building had been acquired by a company called Northgate Property Group. Under British Columbia's Residential Tenancy Act, specifically the end of tenancy provision for major renovations, what locals bitterly called the renoviction loophole. They were terminating all existing leases. We had 72 hours to respond and 4 months to vacate. 4 months sounds like a long time until you start looking for a comparable apartment in the same city. The average one-bedroom in Vancouver was listing at $2,300 a month. With first and last month's rent required up front, that was $4,600 before we even moved a box. We had savings, about $31,000 combined, but after we hired a tenants' rights lawyer named Mr. Haskell, a sharp, angular man who'd been fighting renovictions for 20 years, that number started shrinking fast. He was honest with us from the first meeting. He said Northgate had done this before. 11 buildings in the last 3 years. They had a legal team that specialized in exactly this. We could fight it and we might delay it, but ultimately the legislation had gaps you could drive a moving truck through. He was right. 6 weeks later, the residential tenancy branch ruled in Northgate's favor. The renovation was deemed substantial and legitimate. We had until the end of the month. My partner sat on the edge of our bed that night, surrounded by packing tape and flattened boxes, and said something I still think about. She said, "I don't want to rent anymore. I want something nobody can take back." So we started looking at what $31,000 could actually buy. The answer, in British Columbia, is almost nothing. Except if you look at the right websites at the right time and have a very specific kind of desperation. It was my partner who found it. She was the one who stayed up until 2 in the morning, scrolling through BC assessment listings and tax sale auctions while I stress cleaned the kitchen. She called me over with the kind of quiet urgency that means something is either very good or very strange. The property was in the Caribou region, up near a small community outside Williams Lake. 4 hours northeast of Vancouver, deep in the interior. The listing showed a single photograph, a grainy overhead shot that might have been taken from a helicopter sometime around 2009. What I could make out was a clearing in dense pine forest, and in the center of the clearing, a structure that I generously would call a house. It was a 2-story log-built cabin, approximately 1,500 square feet, sitting on 6.2 acres of unmanaged Crown-adjacent timberland. The previous owner, a man I'll refer to by what the locals called him, Old Harmon, had died without a will 8 years earlier. The province had been sitting on the property ever since, accumulating back taxes. The municipal tax auction starting bid was $19,000, cash only. As is, where is, no inspections, no warranties, no representations. We drove up on a Sunday. The road became unpaved after the last highway junction and stayed that way for 11 kilometers. When we finally found the access trail, I wouldn't call it a driveway. My partner looked at me from the passenger seat and said nothing. The silence said it. We drove in anyway. The cabin was worse in person than the photograph suggested, which is saying something. The main structure had settled badly on one side. Several of the upper logs had pulled apart at the corner joints, and the gaps were filled with what looked like expanding foam and old rags. The porch had partially collapsed. Inside, it smelled like a combination of wood rot, engine oil, and something animal I didn't want to identify. The kitchen ceiling had buckled inward where water had sat for years. Whoever Harmon was, he had clearly stopped maintaining the place well before he died, but the bones were there. The main floor logs were old-growth Douglas fir, 3 feet in diameter at the base. The stone fireplace in the center of the main room went floor to ceiling and was built with the kind of careful, deliberate masonry you don't see anymore. The property itself backed onto a creek that was running clean and clear even in October. And on the south-facing slope behind the cabin, someone had planted an apple orchard decades ago. The trees were overgrown and wild, but they were still producing. There were apples on the ground when we walked through. My partner picked one up, wiped it on her jacket, and bit into it. She chewed for a moment. "It's actually good," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. We put in the bid the next day. Nobody else bid. We wired $19,000 to the municipal tax office on a Thursday afternoon, and we were homeowners by Friday. The drive back up to move in was quieter than the first trip. We had $12,000 left between us, a rented cargo van, and exactly no plan beyond not being evicted again. The first 3 weeks were about survival, not renovation. We had to establish heat before anything else, because the caribou in November is not interested in sentiment. The old wood stove in the kitchen still functioned, barely. We found a cord and a half of split wood stacked under a tarp behind the cabin that Harmon must have cut years before, dry and good. We burned through it fast, and my partner's cousin, who lived in Williams Lake and became our unofficial lifeline, brought us 2 more cords in the back of his truck. I spent the first week doing what I do, measuring. It's reflex for me. When I walk into any building, I'm calculating proportions, looking for where things line up and where they don't. I sketched the floor plan onto graph paper by lamplight our second night there, pacing the rooms with a tape measure while my partner reorganized what little furniture we'd managed to bring. The main floor was straightforward: a living area, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a utility room at the back. The second floor had 2 bedrooms under the steep roofline, low-ceilinged and warm. The total square footage matched what the listing claimed, roughly. The stone fireplace was the anomaly. From the outside, the cabin measured 42 feet along its north wall. Inside, the living area and kitchen and utility room totaled 33 feet. Accounting for log wall thickness, substantial, given the build style, that still left approximately 7 feet unaccounted for. I checked my measurements twice and then a third time because I was certain I'd made an error. I hadn't. The fireplace dominated the center of the main floor, rising from the fieldstone base all the way up through the ceiling and out through the roof. It was impressive construction, but a fireplace and chimney column, even a generous one, should not account for 7 feet of depth. 3 feet, maybe. 4 at an extreme. I knocked on the stone. Solid. I walked to the utility room, which backed up against the rear face of the fireplace, and knocked on the back wall from there. Also solid, but different. The fireplace stone had a deep, resonant knock. The utility room's rear wall, which should have been the same stone formation, had a slightly hollow quality. Not dramatically different, but different enough. I didn't say anything to my partner that night. I lay awake thinking about what old Harmon had been known for in the community, which our cousin-in-law had mentioned almost in passing during one of his supply runs. He said Harmon had lived up there alone for nearly 40 years, wouldn't let surveyors on the property, refused to have the utilities registered under his actual name, paid every municipal fee in person with cash. The locals thought he was just eccentric. A lot of people who move to the Caribou interior are escaping something, and the community generally respects that without asking too many questions. Paranoid survivalist was how our cousin characterized him. Said the old man used to tell people The government kept lists of everyone who had anything worth taking. The next morning, I went into the utility room with a flashlight and a 4-pound hammer and started tapping along the back wall systematically, working from floor to ceiling in columns, listening. The first 2 columns, solid. The third column, starting about 4 feet from the left side of the room, hollow, about 2 feet wide and running from the floor all the way to where the wall met the ceiling joists. I tapped the edges of the hollow's zone carefully. They were solid. Just the center section rang with that different, telling tone. "Come look at something," I called. My partner came in, still in her socks, holding her coffee. I walked her through what I'd found. She listened, looked at the wall, then looked at me. "What's behind it?" she asked. "That's what I want to find out. Is it structural?" I studied the ceiling joist arrangement above us. The logs ran parallel to the front and back walls, supported by the exterior log structure on either side. The utility room's rear wall was not carrying load. "No," I said. "It's a partition. It's just a partition." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay," and went to get her jacket, because the utility room was cold, and she could tell this was going to take a while. I started with a pry bar, working into the lower corner of the hollow section to see what I was dealing with. What I found was not the log structure I expected. Behind a thin layer of old pine board paneling was a frame wall, standard 2x6 lumber studs, the kind of wall you'd add later to subdivide a space. It was decades-old construction, but it was not original to the cabin. Harmon had built this wall himself, years after the cabin was first constructed. I'm a draftsman. I've spent the better part of a decade drawing structural details for other people's builds. I know the difference between load-bearing and partition. I took the pry bar and I started pulling the paneling away. Behind it was a second wall, concrete block, laid rough and dry, without finished mortar work. And behind that, I could hear it when I knocked with the hammer, was open space. I don't have the right word for what I felt in that moment. Not excitement. Something older than excitement. Something that lives at the base of your skull and doesn't have a name. My partner drove into Williams Lake and bought an angle grinder and a set of masonry bits while I continued clearing the paneling. By the time she was back, I had exposed a 4-foot-wide section of the concrete block wall, floor to ceiling. We worked through the afternoon with the grinder and a cold chisel, breaking out the blocks one at a time. The work was loud and slow and filled the utility room with gray dust that settled on everything. The center block came loose around 4 in the afternoon. I pulled it out by hand. Cold air exhaled from the gap, damp, mineral, perfectly still. The smell of somewhere that had been sealed for a long time. I put my flashlight through the opening. The beam reached the far wall of a space approximately 6 feet deep and 12 feet wide, running the full width of the utility room and continuing behind the fireplace structure. The walls were the natural fieldstone of the original cabin foundation. The floor was packed dirt, and sitting in the far right corner, bolted to the fieldstone through a welded steel frame set directly into the rock, was a safe. Not a small home safe, not a gun cabinet. This was an antique Diebold floor safe, the kind manufactured in the 1950s for small-town bank branches and credit unions. Roughly the size of a washing machine, dull green under the dust, with a 4-spoke handle and a combination dial on the front. The kind of safe that gets moved with an engine hoist and a flatbed. There was no earthly reason for it to be in a hidden room behind a rural cabin in the British Columbia interior, and yet there it was. We got the wall fully open and stepped through. My partner shone her flashlight around the space carefully, the way she moves in unfamiliar situations, methodically, taking in the whole picture before reacting. On the left wall, on heavy steel shelving that Harmon must have fabricated himself, sat 3 large military surplus ammunition cans, sealed with rubber gaskets and locking bales. Beside them, a shortwave radio unit, old and dusty, with a logbook beside it. And on the floor in front of the safe, stacked in 2 neat columns, were 8 wooden file boxes of the kind used in offices before digital records, each one sealed with padlocks. "The boxes," my partner said quietly. She was already crouching in front of the nearest one, examining the padlock. It was a basic hardware store lock. She looked at me. The pry bar? We got the first box open in under a minute. Inside, suspended in hanging file folders, were documents. Photocopies, handwritten ledgers, correspondence on letterhead, faded receipts, and a set of maps. The maps were of downtown Vancouver, annotated in pencil. Property lines marked in red ink, with initials and dollar amounts noted beside each one. The letterhead on several documents read, Pacific Cascade Real Estate Holdings Limited. The name meant nothing to me then. We spent that night on the utility room floor with flashlights, pulling documents out of the boxes one by one. Old Harmon, whose full legal name, we learned from the correspondence, was Harold Mercer Hartwell, was not a wilderness hermit who had retreated from the world out of simple preference. He was a man who had retreated because staying in Vancouver had become dangerous for him. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Hartwell had worked as a financial administrator for a shadow operation tied to a man whose name appeared repeatedly across the documents. I won't use his real name, but he was a convicted figure in what became known as a significant British Columbia real estate fraud prosecution in 1986. A prosecution that, notably, only caught some of the people involved. Hartwell had been the record keeper. His job was to manage the paper trail for a network of numbered shell companies that were quietly acquiring residential rental properties across East Vancouver, manipulating provincial land title records, and skimming rental income into private accounts held in the Cayman Islands and later in Luxembourg. The scheme ran for nearly a decade. When the RCMP investigation began closing in, Hartwell made a decision. He photocopied everything, every ledger, every correspondence, every routing slip. He kept the originals long enough to confirm he had what he needed, then he disappeared north. He never used the documents to do anything. As far as we could tell from the records, he simply kept them. 40 years in a sealed room behind a concrete block wall in the middle of the Caribou, waiting for a situation that never came, or a conscience that never quite got loud enough. The last file box held something different from the rest. On top, in an envelope sealed with masking tape and marked with only a date, September 1988, was a handwritten letter. Hartwell's handwriting was small and careful, the kind that takes effort to produce. The letter was addressed to no one specific. It read, in part, like a man trying to explain himself to a version of himself from the future who might someday have to make a decision he couldn't. He wrote that he had been afraid. He wrote that the people he had worked for were not people who accepted consequences gracefully. He named 3 specific properties that the shell company network had used as its most active launder points. He named the numbered company that currently held them. One of those numbered companies. I had to read the entry 3 times to be sure I was reading it correctly, was listed in the provincial corporate registry as the parent entity of a subsidiary called Northgate Property Group. I sat back on the cold dirt floor of that hidden room, and I looked at my partner. She was already looking at me. Her flashlight was pointed at the ceiling between us, diffusing the light, and her face in that glow was the face of someone doing the same math I was doing, arriving at the same answer. The company that had renovicted us out of our Vancouver apartment. The company that had handed us a legal notice on stiff white paper with a city seal and given us 72 hours to respond. The company that had walked away from 11 buildings in 3 years and never faced any meaningful consequence for it. That company existed, in its current form, as the downstream creation of a fraud network its founders had spent 40 years believing had burned cleanly behind them. Hartwell hadn't known about Northgate. He'd been dead before they rebranded, but he had kept a paper trail that ran, in unbroken ink, from the original scheme directly to their corporate structure. My partner was the one who said it first, and she said it very quietly. We have to be careful about how we do this. She was right. Walking into a Williams Lake RCMP detachment, with 8 boxes of 40-year-old real estate fraud documents and a sealed Debold safe was not a plan. It was a way to lose control of a situation we had only just realized we were in. And if the people connected to Northgate were anything like the people connected to their predecessor organizations, There was a version of this that ended badly for us. We needed someone who understood the specific intersection of real estate law, securities fraud, and provincial corporate records. We needed someone who already had a reason to want Northgate in a courtroom. We called Mr. Haskell. He answered on the second ring. It was a Saturday morning. I told him I needed a meeting, that it was urgent, and that it was connected to Northgate. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How soon can you be in Vancouver?" We drove down Sunday. We brought one file box and the handwritten letter. We left everything else locked in the hidden room behind the utility wall, which we had sealed back up with the original paneling. Haskell's office was on West Hastings, 6th floor, with a view of Burrard Inlet that he clearly never looked at anymore. He'd been doing tenants' rights work for so long that the furniture in his office had the quality of furniture owned by someone who stopped caring what it looked like around the turn of the millennium. He had a good mind and a long memory, and he despised Northgate specifically because they'd been a recurring subject of complaints from clients he'd been unable to adequately help for years. When I put the file box on his desk and explained what it contained and where it came from, he did not react the way I expected. He didn't get excited. He went very still and very focused, the way certain professionals do when they understand that something significant has just walked into the room. He spent 2 hours going through the documents, while my partner and I sat across from him and said almost nothing. He asked 3 questions during that time, each one precise and practical. When he finished, he took off his reading glasses, cleaned them with his shirt, and put them back on. "You understand," he said, "that this is not a tenants' rights matter anymore." He explained the scope. What Hartwell had documented touched on violations of the Land Title Act, the Business Corporations Act, and potentially the Criminal Code of Canada, in ways that went well beyond what a provincial tenancy tribunal could address. The RCMP Commercial Crime Section would be the appropriate body, along with the BC Financial Services Authority. But there was a mechanism available to us under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, a civil forfeiture framework, where documented evidence leading to the recovery of assets obtained through fraud could, in certain circumstances, entitle the reporting party to a portion of the recovered value. "How much of a portion?" my partner asked. She had her hands flat on her thighs and her voice was completely level. Haskell looked at her steadily. "It depends on what they recover and what the courts determine, but Northgate's current real estate portfolio in BC has an assessed value in the range of $600 million. If the fraud connection holds, and this documentation is, I want to be clear, unusually thorough, a conservative award calculation would be in the range of 8 to 15%. My partner did the math the same way I did, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "I want something else," I said. "Not just the money." Haskell looked at me. "There are other tenants. People who were renovicted by Northgate from the other 10 buildings. Some of them had nowhere to go. Some of them are still in temporary housing. If this goes the way you're describing, if there's a forfeiture of assets, I want it on the record that we're requesting those buildings be transitioned to nonprofit housing management." Haskell studied me. Then he said, "I can't promise the court will honor that request, but I can make certain it's documented, loudly, as part of the submission." He went to work. The next 4 months were the strangest of my life. On the surface, my partner and I were just 2 people renovating a cabin in the Caribou. We drove into Williams Lake for lumber and insulation. We replaced the collapsed porch. We learned how to point log joints and how to run new electrical through old-growth Douglas fir without losing our minds. We tapped the creek for a gravity-fed water line. The apple orchard got a rough pruning in March, my partner standing on a stepladder with loppers while I held the base, both of us in work gloves and toques, arguing cheerfully about which branches to take. Underneath that, Haskell was working with an RCMP commercial crime team and a BC Financial Services Authority investigator named simply the Analyst, as far as we were concerned. The paper trail Hartwell had maintained was extraordinarily complete. the numbered company connection to Northgate's parent entity held under examination. The RCMP were able to obtain historic corporate registry records that confirmed the unbroken chain of beneficial ownership. Haskell set the trap the same way a careful person does it, with paperwork and patience. He filed a post-tenancy dispute with the residential tenancy branch on our behalf that required Northgate to submit their renovation documentation for the South Granville building where we had lived. The submission triggered a discovery request. The discovery request put Northgate's own corporate structure into a legal proceeding. And once it was in a legal proceeding, the RCMP had the mechanism they needed. We were not present for the morning Northgate's offices were searched. Haskell called us at 7:45 a.m. on a Thursday while we were having coffee on the new porch. He said it in exactly 4 words. "It's happening. Stay home." My partner reached across and took my hand. The man who ran Northgate Property Group. I'll call him the director, because what matters is not his name, but the expression on his face, which I am told by someone who was present in that meeting was that of a person watching 40 years of careful architecture come apart in real time, was arrested that morning. The company's assets were frozen pending the forfeiture proceedings. The renovation notices served to the tenants of all 11 buildings were retroactively voided by order of the Tenancy Tribunal, which found that the substantial renovation claims had been used as a pretext for property clearing, not legitimate repair. 6 months later, Haskell called us from his office in Vancouver with the final numbers. The civil forfeiture had proceeded. Northgate's portfolio had been assessed at $580 million. Our documented contribution to the case had been classified as primary evidence. The award was 11% of recovered liquid assets. We were 30 and 29 years old. We had $19,000 in a rural property and $31,000 in savings 8 months before. We did the math on the new number, and then we drove into Williams Lake and ordered the most expensive dinner on the menu at the restaurant on the main street and barely tasted it. The South Granville building, the one we'd been evicted from, was among 7 Northgate properties transferred under court order to a nonprofit housing society. The former tenants, the ones who could be found, were given right of first return at their original controlled rents. Not all of them came back. Some had rebuilt their lives elsewhere and didn't want to move again, which I understood. But some of them did. As for the Diebold safe, it was opened by a professional locksmith, brought in by the RCMP under warrant. Inside was $160,000 in Canadian currency, bundled in the old pre-plastic $50 bills. Serial numbers tracked to a 1979 Bank of Canada distribution series that had been reported missing from an armored transfer. The money was evidence. The safe was evidence. Harold Mercer Hartwell, who had spent 40 years alone in the Caribou, holding on to everything he knew, had carried all of it to his grave without ever deciding what to do with it. He'd been afraid, and then he'd been old, and then he'd been dead, and the taxes had gone unpaid, and a county had auctioned a property nobody knew was significant, and somehow it had ended up in our hands. I think about him sometimes when I'm on the porch in the evenings. The rebuilt porch, tongue and groove cedar decking, a proper roof overhang, a pair of Muskoka chairs my partner chose and had shipped from a mill in Ontario. The apple trees were pruned again last fall, properly this time, and they came through the winter clean. The creek sounds the same as it did the first night we camped on the floor with an air mattress and no heat and no certainty about anything. We didn't know what we were buying when we bid on this place. We were desperate, and the price was right, and there was nowhere else to go. The cabin was a ruin, and the road was washed out, and the previous owner had spent decades building walls between himself and a world that frightened him. It turned out the walls were the point.